Good morning, everyone. So we start a new sugya. Let me just mute everyone here. Yeah, I see Adam online. Welcome. Okay, so we start the new sugya, which is sugya of Boneh. And all I really want to do today is to try and learn through the Mishnah and also discuss a little bit around the concept of what melachot Boneh is. My comments around what melachot Boneh is are just going to be very, very preliminary because I don't really know what the answer is. In other words, I'm struggling to understand what the essence of the melacha is. To give the headlines, is the melacha about creating structure? Is the melacha about delineating space? Is the melacha about piecing and joining components together? I'm not really sure what the answer to that is, and I just want to share with you. I think what I'm going to say is obvious, really. In other words, if you just look through the sources, I just want to share these sources with all of us, just so we're clear on my confusion. Now, to be clear, all of these do definitely end up as Osa on Shabbos, and either as part of the Av of Boneh or part of the Tolda of Boneh. What I'm trying to ask is, what's the essence of the melacha? In other words, what is the Av melacha of Boneh, and what's the Tolda of Boneh? What categories fall into this? So let's just have a quick look at the Rambam. And here I'm using the Rambam in a sense as a shortcut because the Rambam summarizes various Gemaras that bring all these scenarios. What the Rambam is innovative in is which ones he classifies as the Av and which ones he classifies as the Tolda. So the Rambam's going to give several examples. There's classic Boneh, which is putting stones together. There's Boneh, which is Chofe Guma, if you hollow out a hole in the ground. We learned that for those who were with us when we were learning Klal Godel. We learned this on the very first Omud after the Mishnah. The Gemara said that sometimes you can dig a hole and that can be choresh, and sometimes you can dig a hole and it can be boneh. When you're digging a hole in the ground in order to make an extension, to make a little bit extra room in your house, to create a little storage space, then that will be boneh. Whereas if you're digging in a field, then that maybe would be choresh. Similarly, when you fill in a hole because the floor has a hole in it, if you do that in the field, maybe that would be choresh because you're improving the ground. If you do it in a house, that would be boneh. So that's one sugya. That's an example of boneh beyond the classic putting bricks together. Then we learned the sugya of binyan bekalim. Yesh binyan bekalim, aim binyan bekalim. But the point of binyan there was that you're bringing pieces together and joining components together in interesting ways. Then we didn't learn, but I mentioned several times, the Gemara in Daf Tzadi Hey about magavein, cheese making. The point of cheese making is that the milk coagulates into a block. So you have this liquid. Out of the liquid is drawn various components. I'm not sure I know enough about cheese making to say more than that. And these sort of, I don't know, fatty bits all come together and end up in a mass, a combined mass of pieces. And that's also boneh. So that's another example of boneh. And then we have oyel, which is spreading a tent, a canopy, which is also a type of boneh. And the question is how they all go together. What's the commonality between these? And somewhat how you answer that question will define which ones you think are the Av and which are the Tolda. So again, just to remind ourselves, the Rashi, the Rambam, it's very, very clear that you can have a number of relationships between different melachas. You can have sometimes where it's identical melacha. There's just several ways of doing it, but it's all one shame of melacha. To give a very superficial example of that, if you plant an apple seed or you plant an orange tree seed, it's the same melacha of zorea. That's a very extreme example of that. If you cook food or in a pot, or you cook it in a crock pot, or in a deep frying pan, again, it's really the same melacha. It's just mavashel. Then you have other scenarios which are quite different to each other, but they are deemed as both as ovos, as co-ovos, all within one category of an av. So, for example, ofer and mavashel. They're not identical. Baking and boiling are two different ways, such fundamentally different ways of cooking, that they are deemed two shemus of an av melacha, and yet they both are within the one av melacha of cooking. Or even maybe something as radically different as notea and zorea. Planting a seed or planting a sapling are quite different activities, and yet they're both co-overs. And then you can have something which is an av and a tolda. Sorry, then you can have a relationship in which a melacha still falls under the category, and yet it's so different that it's a tolda. And when we say it's a tolda, it doesn't mean it's just another example. It's genuinely a different melacha. It's another shame melacha. It's a different name. When I'm doing that melacha, I'm not doing the av. I'm doing the tolda with a different shame. It's not just tolda doesn't just mean another example or way of doing things. It's fundamentally a different melacha, and yet it's the tolda of the av. So, for example, zomer, pruning. So zomer engenders growth of the tree. Pruning encourages and engenders growth of the tree. But it's also radically different to being zoreh or notea, and therefore it's a tolda, but it's its own melacha zomer. It's not just another way of sowing a seed. It's a different activity, and therefore it's its own shame melacha, and nonetheless it's a tolda. What difference does the categorization make? The difference is whether in terms of a shogeg of chatos, if I do anything within the same cluster of malachas, they're all one chatos if I made a mistake about them. Things like that. We may see actually later today or not later today, over the next few weeks, we may see another difference between an av and a tolda. But how you classify something as an av and a tolda and what difference it makes whether it falls in the same cluster of malachas. There may be enough commitments with respect to hasra when you warn someone about which activity they're doing. But what's clear is it's incorrect to say there are 39 categories of malacha. There's hundreds of categories of malacha. Zomer is its own category of malacha. Pruning is its own category of malacha. Oife is its own shame malacha. Mavashel is its own shame malacha. Nutea and zorea, planting a sapling and sowing a seed, are their own shameless of malachas. In fact, I think I showed you a Yishalmi in which it says that Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish found 39 toldas to each av of the 39 malachas. So those who are more mathematically able than me will be able to multiply 39 by 39. But there are many categories of malacha. I'm now distracting myself by doing it in my head. So let's switch off from that stupid comment. There are many categories of malachas. There are many shamus of malachas. Some of which are obvious, some of which are toldas. No, there may be practical implications. For example, this we'll see later on. It may well be that if you have one activity which could fall into two categories, the Av will be the senior category over the Tolda, and it'll be defined as one malacha, not. I don't want to give the game away too much because otherwise I'm ruining my future shiurim. But we have actually discussed this in the past though, and we'll get to this again. We saw the Rambam son, the letter from Ram ben Rambam, and we're going to see another example of that now. And we're also going to look at this with Makib Patish. Could something end up as being both Makib Patish and another Malacha? For example, we just now, when we learned Kosei, we discussed, if you write the last letter in a book, so you're chayiv, even if you only write one letter, not two letters, would that also be Makib Patish? I don't want to over confuse this, but the issue of what's an Av and what's a Tolda is quite fraught and not a simple one at all. For our purposes, all I want to look at is what is the Av Melacha? Oh, what is the Av Melacha? Not so simple. What is the Av Melacha of Boneh? And what is Boneh? Is Boneh fundamentally, I don't know, let's say combining components and therefore spreading an oihal, a tent, is only a tolda because it's actually completely different shame Melacha? Or is spreading a tent somehow really similar to Boneh? Maybe it's part of the Av. What's the relationship between the two? How do the different categories all fit together? There is, by the way, since we discussed Megavin, I put the whole quote of Megavin because it includes one of my favorite lines in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Tzadi Hey, in which the Gemara says, Megavin mishum my mechayiv. Why are you chayiv for Megavin? Answers Rav Nachman bar Giyur. So Rav Nachman bar Giyur arrives in the yeshiva. This is the story. He arrives in Natandar, and all the Talmidim are very excited. The Gadol has turned up, and they ask him, Cholev mishum mechayev. I put Megavin in highlights because that's what we're doing. Why are you chayev for cholev? What malacha are you doing when you do cholev? Amalahu mishum cholev. It's because of cholev. Mechabitz mishum mechayev. Amalu mishum mechabitz. Megavin mishum mechayev. Cheese making mishum mechayev. Mishum megavin. Omru Leis, they said to him, Rabach kotel komi ba'agmahu. You're a reed harvester. You're chopping reeds in the meadow. In other words, that's not Torah. You're chopping. You're going to come. Be a reed chop. Okay. Also, Shoel Bey Medrash, they went on asking the Bey Medrash, Omri Lechilav Chayv Mishum Afarik, Mechavin Chayv Mishum Boya, Megavin Chayv Mishum Boya, Megavin is Chayv because of Boneh. So my Rosh Yeshiva, so it's a very strange Gemara. Is cholev chayv mishum cholev? Is megavin chayv mishum megavin? What's he answering? It sounds like a joke. Why are you chayv mishum megavin mishum megavin? Answer like a mensch, like the Gemara eventually does. Megavin is a tolda of Boneh. Now Shiva said is making this very good point. He was saying to them, Megavin is its own shem malacha. Don't think that Megavin is just an example of Boneh. That's often when one, sort of in a childish way, one learns Avos and Toldos. And Toldos just means another example of building is a very interesting example, is putting, causing cheese to coalesce together, to coagulate together and become a block, where all the little bits of milk inside coalesce and become a block. No, says Rav Nachman Magyar, it's not a it's not an example of a melacha. It's its own shem melacha. So megavin mishumay mechayiv mishum megavin. It's a shem melacha. That's if I have to list all the melachas there are in the world. One of the shemus melacha is cholev. One of the shemus melacha is megavin. They weren't asking that or didn't understand what he was saying, so they went to the base medrash and said, what's the answer? And the answer is Megavin Mishum Boneh. Which answer is correct? Both answers are correct. Megavin is a tolda of Boneh, but in a sense, a deeper answer to the question is Megavin is its own category of melacha. That's the pshat Gemara, and I as I said, I think it's such like a fundamental idea in understanding what melachas are. So Megavin, at least if we read that Gemara correctly, we know is a tolda of Boneh. It's not Boneh itself. But what is Boneh itself? So what I want to do is have a look at the Rambam together and just see how the Rambam categorizes things. And we'll come out that it's actually very hard to understand what the Rambam thinks is the essence of the melacha of Boneh, but let's attempt to do so. Halacha hey. Rambam Hilchos Shabbos Perek Yud. I first printed, by the way, in Hilchos Shabbos Perek Zayin. This is Chazorah. We've seen this Rambam countless times. And the Rambam says, "Hatolda hi melacha hadoim la'av meina melachas," etc. So the Rambam tries to define what tolda is. By the way, for those interested more in this topic, on this Rambam in Perek Zayin, there is a Maggid Mishnah who speaks about what makes something an av and what makes something a tolda. And the Rambam in Perish Mishnayos and Daf Ein Gimel on the Mishnah of Kal Gadol, where the Mishnah lists all the Lamentas melachas, he also speaks quite at length about what an av and what a tolda is. Please work your way through these sources, and once you're clear on them, let me know so that. It's very unclear. The Rambam is conceptualizing what an av and what a tolda is. It's really vitally important. For someone who wants to learn Shabbos in depth, really important to have a look at these Mara Makomas. I didn't put them on the sheet because we looked at them once when we did Daf Ein Gimel, and it's very hard to understand what the Rambam is saying. The Rambam is setting out to answer these questions that we're puzzled by. What is an av and what is a tolda? And on Halacha Vav, he says, someone who takes milk, v'nosam b'keva, and you put in it keva, which is the catalyst, which causes it to the reaction to occur. Enzyme, organic catalysts are called enzymes. In order to coagulate it. And he says it's etc. In govno, so basically, there's two stages in cheese making. You have a liquid, you extract the fat from it, and you're left with whey, which is like just the milk liquid. That's machabit, and that's borah, separating. And then there's bringing those bits together to become a block, which produces the cheese product, and that's megavin. One is a tolda of borah, one's a tolda of Boneh. That's what the Rambam is saying. And then he says, Shekol. Let's learn halacha vav inside. So you put the enzyme into it in order to separate the liquids from the solids. How is a chayv mishum toldos borah? That's borah. Because you separated the milk from the whey. And if you then made it into cheese, you cheese made it, then you'll chayv mishum boneh. Why? Anyone who joins part to part and sticks it together till it becomes one body, this is doimeh lebinyan. Obviously, Yeshua told us, and similarly, all melachos have told us, as we have explained. So this Rambam in Perek Zayin is not yet in Hilchos Boneh. Rambam Hilchos Boneh is Perek Yud. Just to contextualize the Rambam, Perek Zayin is where the Rambam is listing all the melachos. So he's copying the Mishnah more or less in Perek Kal Gadol. And then he wants to explain the concept of Av and Tolda. And fortunately, from our point of view, given that we're learning Boneh, the example he chooses is Boneh and Megavin. One of the examples he chooses, he gives several examples. And he says Boneh is Mekabitz Chalokim, is merging pieces together. And therefore, Megavin is Chayev Mishum Boneh as a Tolda of Boneh. So he's very clear that Megavin is a Tolda, but equally the logic of why it's a Tolda, or the reason why it's a Tolda, is because it's bringing pieces together. Let's have a look in Rambam Hilchos Shabbos Perek Yud. We're now learning the halachas of Boneh. We're now in the context of Amorei Nozona. Haboneh kol shu chayev. That shouldn't be a surprise to you because that's our Mishnah. That's what our Mishnah is coming to say. Haboneh kama yivna ve'chayev. Haboneh kol shu. You have to build anything. What does kol shu mean, by the way? What's the translation of that kol shu? Any amount. What's the literal translation of the word kol shu? All that is, something like that. Something like that. All that is. So it's important to understand kol shehu doesn't quite mean any amount, even something infinitely small. It means anything that is, anything that is something. But something still has to be something. In other words, there's no shiur given in the Torah, like a gazayis or grogeres. But it still has to be something. Let's say there was no shiur in the Torah for achila. Right? So, kazayis, we know that in many halachas of the Torah, you have to eat a kazayis before you're chayev. If you eat a kazayis of chometz, only when you eat a kazayis of chayev. If you ingressed a crumb of chometz as you were breathing or something like that, would that be what kol shu meant? There has to be some significant. Kol shu means anything that is. In other words, in human functionality terms, something has happened. There isn't the point of a shiur. The Gemara says all shiurim are halacha Moshe Messinai. The point of a shiur is that it's a measure. In other words, a mechitza has to be yud tzefachim. Is something a barrier if it's 9 tefachim? Yeah. Is it more of a barrier if it's 9.5 tefachim? Yeah. Is it more of a barrier if it's 10 tefachim? Yeah. If it's 10.5 tefachim, it's yet more of a barrier. So it increases being ever more barrying away as it gets taller and taller. It acts as a better. At some point, you have to draw a line. Where do you draw the line? In a sense, it's arbitrary. In terms of human functionality, there's no logical place to draw the line. It's not something that we can sit and reason about. You have to draw the line somewhere. That's what we mean when we say it's Halacha Moshe Messinai. Halacha Moshe Messinai means it's top down, it's not bottom up. It's not something where Svara can help you. The Gemara makes this point. It says a mikveh has to be 40 sar. It says a boim sar chasa quartov. If it's missing a quarter of a milliliter, it's a possible mikveh. And chas v'shalom, someone's Tomei, they go to the base of mikdash, he has creases, nidar, it hasn't over the mikveh. A boim sar with that quartov, suddenly is kosher. There isn't a human reason or logic that you can say. There is a difference. It's not an irrational law. It makes sense that you have to draw a line somewhere, and clearly 9 tefachim is less of a mechitza than 10 tefachim, and 10 tefachim is less of a mechitza than 11 tefachim. So there's nothing wrong with the Torah giving the boundary at 10. It's not problematic in reason, but there's nothing in human reason that can generate this. It's top down. It's the Torah gives us. Hashem gave us the line of what point. There is another way that you could have had shiur, which is bottom up, which is human functionality. At some point, something becomes meaningful. At that point, kol shu, anything that is, something that has some functionality to it or some meaning to it. If in nano engineering, two pieces of two atoms were put one on top of the other, that wouldn't be boneh. That's not what kol shehu means. Not just because it's invisible to the naked eye, and people say anything that's invisible to the naked eye is insignificant. If you have a hole in the ground, which is also an example of boneh, and one flick of dust falls into that hole, there's no measurable or noticeable impact in human functionality in any meaningful way on having done that. That wouldn't be kol shehu. Kol shehu means anything, kol shehu, anything that is. There has to be an isingness to it. There has to be an impact to it. The point of the Gemara isn't that any size, however small, the point of the Gemara is don't look for a shiur here. It's not, there is no halacha Moshe Messinai of which we are aware, says the Gemara, that gives a top-down shiur. It's anything where it has an impact on functionality. Would a mechitza, if we didn't have halacha Moshe Messinai, of one etzba be a mechitza? In any way does it act as a boundary? I don't know, maybe it depends on context, which is what the Gemara says about Boneh, that it depends on context. Maybe for some things, if I don't know, if I have an ant cage or maybe an amoeba cage, maybe a etzba is a very good mechitza for an amoeba cage. But for most things, maybe it's a meaningless mechitza. So that's what kol shehu means. Kol shehu means, and that's why indeed how the Gemara then goes on to explain kol shehu. If we understand what the Gemara is saying, that there has to be something. There has to be something there. So the Rambam says in Halacha Yud Beis, Haboneh kol shehu chayev. Hamashve pnei hakarka b'bayis k'gon shehishpil tel. If you smooth the ground in a house, for example, you lowered a mound, a milogay, or you filled in a trough, a valley. How is there boneh b'chayev? That's the Gemara on in Klal Golda that we learned. So all these, he says, a chayev. Implication of Rambam is that that filling in the trough or the hole is or leveling the mound is also the av of boneh. Is that correct? At least a co-av of boneh, the av. Because in Halacha Yud Gimel, he says, "Ha'isa el kavura, how is that told us boneh the chayev?" This is a told of boneh. So this is very interesting. The same Rambam that told us that makabetz chalokim, joining pieces, is the essence of boneh, and therefore megavin is a tolda of boneh because you're joining the to make it into a cheese. The same Rambam also says that removing a mound in your house to create usable floor space, which is why it's Boneh, is also an Av of Boneh. Very interesting. So presumably he means a co-Av of Boneh, because it's not identical to putting bricks together. If I put two bricks one on top of the other, that's Boneh, because I'm combining parts. I'm building. If I remove a mound, there's in the middle of my floor in an age where people lived with earth floors, and you smooth out the floor, you're making functional floor space. So that's also Boneh, says the Rambam. But that's not Boneh of being Makabet's Chalokim. Very interesting. And yet he seems to say that's the Av. That's another example of an Av Melacha. So we already have floating in our heads two definitions of the Av Melacha, creating usable space and joining pieces together. And those are co-overs. What makes them co-overs? I don't know exactly. It's interesting. But you're making usable space. When you make a keli, when you join parts of a kelim together, if yesh binin of a kelim, you're joining components together. It's nothing to do with space. But it's enough to be bonus to create usable space, even when you're removing a tel. Very, very interesting idea. Let's move on to halacha. Yud Gimel the Rambam then goes on to other examples where two people do it together and so on. We're not going to learn that. Halacha Yud Gimel ha'isa oyel kavua ha'izeh told us bonah v'chayv. If you make a fixed tent, that's a tolda of bonah and chayv. V'chena oysa kli adama. If you make this again, we learnt in Daf Ein Daled in Klal Gadol. If you make a earthenware vessel, tano, an oven, v'chovis, or a earthenware pitcher. Before they get burnt in the kiln. So you're molding clay together. How is that told us Boneh v'chayev? How is that told us Boneh? So similarly, making a kavina is told us Boneh. So these accounts has told us why they told us because of what he explained us in Perek Zion that you're combining parts together. When you clay make, you're also combining parts together. So that's also a tolda of Boneh. Finally, for our purposes. Hamachnis yad hakadam b'toich ha'ayin shelo, how is that told us Boneh? Fitting a axe handle into an axe. So you have an axe head with a hole in it, and you fit the handle into the hole, into the axe head. It's a told of Boneh. Why? Because it's combining parts. Hatakeya 8 if you stick a peg into wood, that's a told of Boneh. That's Halacha Yud Gimel. Halacha Yud Daled ha'isa nekev kolshu belul shel tanagonim k'dei sheyachnus ora. If you make a hole, even kolshu, however much it is, into a pen of a coop of Tanagolim, in order that light should come in. Yechayiv mishum Boneh. Why Yechayiv mishum Boneh? Because you're physically in a structure, change the structure to add functionality. How much is kol shehu again? Not a nano, not a tiny hole. There has to be enough of a hole that makes a difference to Tanagolim. I'm no expert on Tanagol psychology, but whatever the level of light that Tanagolim needs, that hole is kol shehu. That's the point again. There's no shear. It's a kol shehu. Does he mean in Halacha Yudalad that's a av or a tolda? Not entirely clear. Okay, so very interesting. So we now have joining pieces together, which in Perek Zion he's taught us to think of as the ikar of Boneh, and that has a number of toldas of other ways of joining pieces together, like sticking handles into axe heads, and like clay making, and like cheese making, and these are all toldas. Then we have another av of Boneh, which is removing a mound, for example, in which no attachment is being made. On the contrary, I'm removing the mound, but I'm creating space, and that's also the av of Boneh. And then he has even changing a structure in a way that adds functionality, such as making a hole in the pen so that light can come in. That's also told of Boneh or av of Boneh. We're not entirely sure, but there's another category of Boneh. So we're left with and then we've got Poris Oyel, which we'll look at by itself because there's a lot of discussion around this, which is also a tolda of Boneh. So this is all very unclear. Is there a common denominator? They're all, I guess, about way. I don't even know how to guess. What is the common denominator over here?
They're all adding functionality towards an end purpose.
Yeah, that's true, but almost every melacha is adding functionality. That's the problem to an end purpose. So, Oifem Mevashel is adding functionality, cooking, sewing, weaving, writing. So that is true. All melacha is adding functionality. Do we have a common denominator in this functionality here? I'm not entirely sure. It is maybe something about physical parts. It's also a little messy because with weaving, you're also joining physical threads together. Could weaving have been Boneh other than that it has its own separate melacha? We will look at this later. Maybe weaving could have been Boneh had it not had its own category melacha, but it's got its own significance, and therefore it's a type of joining parts that has a significance to it. Therefore, it gets another shame melacha. All very, very, very murky, gentlemen, but not clear at all. Either way, this is what the Rambam says. I just want to make a couple more points around this. And the first is, interestingly, he says, and again, this isn't really the chiddush of the Rambam. I think I printed this on the handout sheet. Yeah, at the bottom in the sugya of Megavin, Shabbos Daf Tzadi Hey. Let's have a look at the top line. Tana Rabbanon Hacholiv Mechabitz Megavin Grogeres. So the Gemara says that the shear of Megavin is Grogeres, and the Rambam says this here in Halacha Yud Gimel. How is that told us Boneh? So very interesting. When it comes to cheese making, the shears are Gergeres. When it comes to holes in lul making, the shears Kol Shehu. When it comes to Boneh, the shears Kol Shehu. And presumably when it comes to clay making, also the shears Kol Shehu. Now Kol Shehu again doesn't mean nothing. It means as soon as you get the smallest functional container, that would be enough to make you chayev on Shabbos for clay making. So Megavein has its own share of Gregaris. How can that be? If all the toldas are joining pieces together, how can Megavein? And by the way, Gregaris is a food share. Yeah. Right, Gregaris is a share that we find with foods. It's not a share you can't have with clay making Megavein. The concept doesn't make sense. Sorry, Gregaris. Kind of the clay making Gregaris. Gregaris is not a clay share; it's a food share. Very interesting idea. So the best we can say is remembering Gary's Rabbi Zobin and Aramam that he mentions. The best we can say is that a tolda doesn't have to be identical to an Av. Toldas have their own rules. That's Rabbi Zobin and Aramam's point. I'll come to in a second. Rabbi Zobin and Aramam, in the context of what he was talking about, was surprised by someone who attacked his father for Psak, where Tolda behaved differently to Av. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. This is a Tolda, this is an Av. Don't confuse the categories. So it seems Megavin is its own shame melacha. It's not just that Megavin is another example of, we could have thought that clay making and Megavin are just identical. They're just both joining sticky bits together, right? That's the definition of melacha. Joining sticky bits together is a shame and also not true. Megavin is its own shame melacha. We have no less authority than Rav Nachman bar Guria, who said that. Megavin, Mishum Megavin, it's its own shame melacha. And the shame melacha of Megavin, even though it's a told of Boneh, has a completely different share. There is a halacha in the Mishum Sinai share. Why? Because it's a food making melacha. As soon as you have food making, the share is Gergeres, and this is found in many halachas of food melachas. A clay making is not food making. With clay making, for whatever reason, Hashem didn't give us a top-down share. We only have bottom-up share. And what does bottom-up share? Not a share, but just human functionality. Very, very, very interesting. Yeah.
I think that could it not just be that is what a culture is with regards to food stuff? So actually, the definition of the Shiur for all melachos is a culture. It's just for some of them, we have a sort of either back the data or something that defines this is what a significant amount of.
It's problematic on two levels. One is because Kazayas is less than that, and this is significant in other contexts. It's difficult because people go to often eat less than a goes. You go to Simcha. Back in the good old days, you got a nice bridge roll with tuna on it, and you had something. So now you go to Simcha and you get a tiny little thing, and that's deemed pasha. So no, but on a serious note, that people eat smarty, right? That's deemed a reasonable amount of food. If we're not doing top down shiurim, if we're doing bottom up, then a little bit of food has a little chashivas, and more food is more chashivas. But there's no point in which to draw the line necessarily, or clearly, yeah.
Why would we focus the making of the cheese and the amount of quantity we're going to eat? The making of cheese could be that this is is that you need a certain quantity of stuff to coalesce to actually form the cheese together, right?
But then it would mean that if I came up with a new cheese making technology which was less gregarious, gregarious rings a bell. Gregarious is one of the Halacha Mishum Sinai type shiurim that's given. It appears throughout Shas, it's certainly hilchos in melachos, any food making melachos, and it appears many food making melachos, and it appears every other. Gregarious is a classic example of a top down share. The whole point of a top down share is it's halacha mishum sinai. The whole point of halacha mishum sinai is it's not that it's unreasonable, but it's not reason generated. It's a little bit of food is a little bit chashuv, more food is more chashuv, and at some point you have to draw the line of chashivas. The whole point of kol shehu is it's about human functionality. There is no God-given cut-off point. Gregarious is, to my mind, very, very clear, decisively halacha mishum sinai, and it turns out that Megavein, even though it's Boneh, we view as a food-making melacha, and therefore it has a food-making share, and other Boneh is not food-making, and therefore doesn't have food-making share. Very, very, very interesting. I wonder, halacha l'maisa, in terms of hilchos oichel nefesh, okay, this is a separate, I'm not going to into this, but it's just interesting which category of melachos one puts this in. Okay, we'll stop here for today, and please God carry on next week and talk more about this. I would urge everyone that there will not be for technical reasons Shiur this Tuesday. So I would urge, though, everyone, there will be a shiur next Sunday. I would urge everyone to work their way through the onwards, because we are going to learn the onward well, but it's worth seeing everything. And also, I've given a fairly hefty amount of Maram Komis for people to work through also, but they're all important. So we will go through them. I wish you having a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you to those who have joined online. Nice to see you all.